In 1991, Ukraine declared itself independent as the Soviet Union collapsed around it. For years after, the new Russian Federation struggled to find its footing, and for a small time, there were hopes that the Cold War could be left in the past, and Russia would find its way to embracing better relationships with the West. However, those hopes were dashed with the election of President Vladimir Putin, a Cold War-era Soviet spy who was still stuck with a Cold War mentality. For Putin, the Soviet Union might have collapsed, but the dream of Soviet greatness wasn't dead, and the one thing standing between his dream and the new Russian Federation was the West. In Putin's eyes, Russia was forever locked in a zero-sum game with the West, and there could only be one victor. As the Soviet Union disintegrated, newly freed Soviet republics and former client states immediately sought out membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For those former republics and client states, it was the only way to guarantee their newfound independence after decades of brutal rule and oppression by the Kremlin. The Soviet Union might be gone, but nobody had any illusions about the Russian Federation suddenly wanting to be BFFs with the world, and the election of Vladimir Putin only reinforced a growing need for NATO membership. In 1990, NATO had promised that the alliance would not expand an inch to the east, yet this was before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and clearly meant that the alliance wouldn't seek to expand into East Germany while the nation was divided. There had never been any discussions about NATO not expanding eastward toward Russia's borders after the collapse, as confirmed by Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. That doesn't mean that Russia didn't warn NATO about expanding, it's just that there was no formal agreement against expansion. For Russia, NATO expanding eastward triggered fears of past historical invasions of Russia by foreign powers. The nation has suffered greatly from foreign invaders, and thus after World War II, Stalin worked hard to ensure that Eastern Europe remained under his influence. Europe was thus divided along Germany, with the Soviet Union controlling everything in Europe east of Germany and using it as a security buffer between itself and the West. The buffer served two purposes. First, it was a physical barrier to invasion. After both German invasions and the invasion of the French during the Napoleonic War, Russia suffered great loss of life and damage to its economy. Eastern Europe was now a shield that protected the motherland, with any would-be invader having to pass through the entire Soviet bloc to reach Russian lands. Even better, millions of Eastern Europeans would themselves be thrown into war to protect the Soviet Union, placing the nation in the strongest position it's enjoyed since the heights of the Russian Empire. But this barrier was also an ideological one, meant to keep Western capitalist influence away from the Soviet homeland. The power of the Communist Party depended on keeping Stalinist ideology alive inside the Soviet Union. Liberal Western values and democracies threatened this. This has never been more true than it was post-2000s, after Vladimir Putin's rise to power. Liberal Western values are now seen as an infection in Russia because they threaten President Putin's absolute power on the Russian government. For Putin, Russia today is under assault by Western culture, and he spent great efforts in waging a propaganda war both within and outside its borders. The last thing Putin or his elites want is a free, democratic Russia, and the only way they can prevent the ever-brewing political unrest amongst the population is by creating boogeymen out of the West to unite the Russians against. Starting in the early 2010s, Ukraine now wished to draw itself closer economically and politically with the West, much to Putin's dissatisfaction. At first, there was a wish to be more economically tied to the West to ensure Ukraine's prosperity, but as Russia exerted more pressure on Ukraine, a growing movement to formally join NATO grew inside Ukraine. Putin attempted to suppress this desire through intimidation and by using propaganda inside of Ukraine, even by infiltrating its government. In 2014, the situation came to a crisis point when President Viktor Yanukovych, a Putin stooge, refused to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union, which would have drawn Ukraine deeper into the West's fold both economically and politically. Instead, President Yanukovych ignored the Ukrainian parliament's overwhelming desire to sign this agreement and chose to draw closer to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union, headed by the Russian Federation and made up of former Soviet states. The result was immediate, as protesters took to the streets and a full-blown civil insurrection threw Kyiv into chaos. The Ukrainian people had freed themselves from Russian rule and had no wish to go back to being a mere client state, and brutal clashes took place between protesters and police. The Revolution of Dignity, as it came to be known, resulted in the occupation of the government buildings across Ukraine and the expulsion of President Viktor Yanukovych from power. Soon after, Yanukovych went into exile in Russia, and Russia responded to the coup by taking Crimea and supporting the breakaway provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. Russia orchestrated pro-Russian demonstrations in Sevastopol, and 4 days later, Russian troops without insignia stormed into the parliament of Crimea and seized it, while other Russian troops took key strategic sites along the peninsula. With the peninsula secure, the Russian Federation installed the pro-Russian Sergei Aksyonov into power. Shortly after, there was a referendum that resulted in 97% of voters choosing for Crimea to be absorbed by the Russian Federation. Perhaps unsurprisingly, those votes were never verified by any independent agency, and the United Nations voted overwhelmingly to consider the referendum illegal. Thus, to this day, internationally, Crimea is still considered as belonging to Ukraine. But with Vladimir Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons, nobody sought to use military force to liberate the occupied peninsula. At the same time that Russian forces were seizing Crimea, Russia's infamous Little Green Men, so-called for their green insignia-less uniforms, moved into the separatist regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, working alongside separatists and even engaging in fighting themselves. Russia denied allegations that its military was in the separatist regions, but the ruse was all but given up over time, as even Russian armor joined the fighting against Ukrainian forces. The Donbass War, as it came to be known, would rage until 2022, culminating in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The real question is, though, what does President Vladimir Putin really want to do with Ukraine when the war is all over? The answer depends on how the war ends. The least likely way that this war ends is with a full occupation of Ukraine by Russian forces. Initially, Putin claimed that he had no intention of occupying any part of Ukrainian territory, and that his advance on Kyiv was merely meant to remove what he called pro-Western Nazi government from power. In the early stages of war, this might have been true. Putin may truly have not wished to physically occupy Ukraine, and instead settled for installing a puppet government. This would turn Ukraine into a client state, much like Belarus, without the hassle of having to pacify an inevitable insurrection by physically occupying it. It would also achieve his grand aim of weakening NATO by denying it yet another member, especially one situated right on Russia's soft southern belly. However, as the Russian advance into Kyiv faltered and then failed entirely, Putin's strategy seemed to radically change as well. Accepting that he would be unable to take Kyiv and topple the government, Russian forces instead focused on breaking out of the separatist regions and seizing the all-important Ukrainian southern coast along the Sea of Azov. With this coastline firmly under Russia's control, Vladimir Putin now has a land corridor from Russia straight to Crimea, and Crimea's water supply can no longer be threatened by Ukrainian dams, as had happened after the annexation, when Ukraine blocked Crimea's drinking water in retaliation to the invasion. This land corridor, however, also gives Russia complete control over the Sea of Azov, essentially turning it into a Russian lake. Putin's forces now try to push north and west out of the land corridor, and seem to want to take as large a chunk of Ukraine as possible. What's more important, however, is extending a corridor to the west, all the way to Odessa and the Moldovan border. This would give Russia complete control over Ukraine's shipping ports and thus allow it to choke off Ukraine economically, but also allow it to link up with its forces inside the Moldovan breakaway region of Transnistria. Russia currently has 1,500 personnel there, and it's greatly feared that linking a land corridor across southern Ukraine will allow it to move more forces into the region and eventually take all of Moldova. This will give Russia control over half of the Black Sea and extend a security buffer out from Russia's vulnerable southern regions in case of a war with NATO. It's now certain that Putin wishes to completely annex occupied territories inside of Ukraine, as starting May 1st, the ruble was introduced as the official currency in the occupied areas that remain relatively stable and in Russian hands. Street and building signs were also all taken down and replaced with their Russian equivalent, and Russia guaranteed the pension payments of Ukrainian pensioners living in the territories. Even more importantly, Russian state TV was brought to the occupied territories, allowing Russia to feed those living under occupation a steady stream of Russian propaganda. Putin's goal is now territorial expansion, and it seems as if his plans for Ukraine hinge on what happens next in the war. Russian forces seem incapable of truly taking the whole of Ukraine, and the commitment by the West, especially the United States, to arm the Ukrainians makes it a complete impossibility that Russia will be able to take over the entire country. However, Russian forces may be able to seize that all-important land corridor to Moldova and take Odessa, even though this is in question, seeing as 3 months into the war, Russia is yet to bring Mariupol under its full control. Further west, Kherson is a critically important city to capture, and as of the writing of this video, Ukrainian forces are launching successful counterstrikes against Russian forces around the city. This makes a breakout to Odessa extremely unlikely, but this isn't Russia's only problem. Corruption and incompetence across all levels of the Russian military have resulted in massive casualties and great loss of equipment in the invasion. The effects of these losses on Russia's ability to continue fighting are only compounded by the astounding amount of sanctions levied against Russia by by the international community. Of greatest importance, though, are those targeting Russia's foreign reserves, which fund the war, and of which half have been frozen by Western governments. Of second most importance is the complete ban on selling electronic components to Russia, which are desperately needed by its military to rearm itself with 21st century weapons. Already, Russian drones and other advanced weapons are being discovered with computer chips ripped out of coffee makers and dishwashers, and Russian jet fighters have been discovered with commercial GPS devices taped to the dash. With the West feeding Ukraine a steady diet of high-tech Western weapons, and with Russia's own stockpile of advanced equipment drying up, it's becoming increasingly impossible for Russia to truly win inside Ukraine. As Europe is committed to an incremental ban on Russian energy imports over the next year or so, Russia's economic situation will only grow more desperate, and its ability to continue this conflict will be in serious jeopardy. Russia is thus likely to attempt to settle the war by holding on to territories it's managed to secure, adding them to the Russian Federation, and weakening Ukraine. Ukraine itself has been willing to compromise by becoming a neutral nation, with neutrality enshrined in its constitution and thus seeking no closer ties to the West. However, Ukraine wishes to have guarantor states sign this neutrality agreement, with nations legally bound to come to Ukraine's defense in case of another Russian invasion. Yet, as reports of Russian brutality against civilians continue to surface from occupied areas, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has stated that he is less and less interested in such a deal. Ultimately, unless Russia achieves some miraculous battlefield reversals, Putin's future plans for Ukraine may not matter at all.